out funds to Indigenous organisations. But her claim to be Aboriginal and the claims of 10 other ATSIC candidates were challenged in court. The challenge was backed by the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, led by the high-profile activist Michael Mansell. Mansell wants stringent controls on who can vote in Indigenous elections.
If white people want to run around and say they're Aborigines, or as one person says, they're the keeper of the spirit of the cow pasture meadow tribe, then that's entirely up to them. It's a freedom of speech. But if they want to participate in elections that are set up for Aboriginal people and only for Aboriginal people, then they should be able to satisfy the criteria that they are in fact Aborigines to participate.
The court case was judged on 3 federal guidelines: self-identification as an Aboriginal person, community recognition and family descent. All remain contentious. Oakford lost her case and had to stand down from ATSIC, but Justice Merkel's decision that the case against the other 9 couldn't be proved angered Mansell.
There is something like 300-odd thousand Aboriginal people in Australia. If this decision is left to stand, then the population of Aborigines in Australia could climb to 2 million within 12 months.
Several of those who feature in this programme were challenged in court and regard the judgment as a vindication of their claim to be Aboriginal.
Well, that finding of Justice Merkel's has never, ever been appealed or challenged, and stands to this day as far as the Federal Court of Australia is concerned. But then you have the likes of Michael Mansell who don't want to accept that.
Historian Cassandra Pybus says Justice Merkel's ruling didn't help solve the question of Aboriginal identity.
It was very damaging. I could see that he did not want to make a judgment that would in any way impact on people who were stolen from their families and could not, in fact, identify their ancestry. But at the same time, he basically says, you can define yourself as being Aboriginal if you believe it to be true. And I think that has opened the way to, as I say, anybody can call themselves Aboriginal and get away with it.
In fact, during the last 15 years, the number of Tasmanians identifying themselves as Aboriginal has more than doubled to 15,700. This year, a new Indigenous role has been set up. However, just 1,300 have applied to join it. All but 300 have been challenged by others. In a pilot scheme which could be repeated around Australia, a panel has been appointed to consider those challenges. Oakford is one of those who's having to justify her ancestry.
I don't think there's a lot of people out there that are very comfortable with this process. They ask the question why that they should have to go through this process to say who they are.
Tasmania is now the focus for a growing national debate about Indigenous identity. The arguments are being played out in what is culturally the least Aboriginal state in the country. It's a highly urbanised community with no remaining Indigenous language or traditional ceremonies.
There's a problem in Tasmania because what constitutes Tasmanian Aboriginal culture, given that it was pretty well destroyed.
The thorny issue of identity and what now constitutes Aboriginality has its roots in Tasmania's history. After the European settlers arrived, a protracted war of attrition ensued. The Aborigines fought a fierce guerrilla campaign for their land. Hundreds were killed in the brutal Black War.
It was one of the clearest cases of genocide that we know of, and recognised as such at the time. There were a handful of Aboriginal people who escaped that process, and it is from them that the current Aboriginal community is descended.
In 1833, an agreement was reached with the Aboriginal fighters, already depleted by hunger and sickness, to leave the mainland and be settled on Flinders Island in Bass Strait. Chief Manalagenna was one of those who went. Many now see him as their ancestor.
He was one of the most important Aboriginal leaders in Tasmania. A clever man, a great warrior. His daughters became the consorts, if you like, of sealers on the Bass Strait Islands. So yes, from those daughters, a great many people are descended.
The settlement on Flinders Island was a catastrophe. Most of the Aborigines died, struck down by tuberculosis and other diseases. Manalagenna died of pneumonia. In 1847, the survivors were taken back to mainland Tasmania. In 1876, the legendary Truganini died. She was seen as the last of her race.
There were, of course, many people who were of Aboriginal descent living on the Bass Strait Islands. And this was known at the time, but they were seen as being something different. They were seen as half-castes. So that there was that view that she was the last of the tribe.
Eminent historians have long taken the view that Tasmania's core surviving Aboriginal community comes from the Bass Strait, islands like Flinders and Cape Barren.
The main group with Tasmanian Aboriginal women, with European men, but there were also a few Australian Aborigines and probably some Maoris and other people, because the sealing industry, which basically was where this community originally came from, was one of those very mixed sea-based communities that you had all across the Pacific.
Two such women who married European men were Dolly Dalrymple and this woman, Fanny Cochrane-Smith.
They were related to the Bass Strait people, but came to the mainland and married Europeans, and in both cases had large families. So in a sense, those two lines are offshoots of the Bass Strait communities.
I'm not sure how old I am, but that's me there. I am.
100 years after the Aborigines were removed from Flinders, Gary Maynard was forcibly removed from Cape Barren Island and brought back over to northern Tasmania. The memory is still painfully vivid.
I was taken by the welfare department from the island without notice in October 1959. I was taken out of the classroom, flown off the island to Launceston, and I was placed with a family in Launceston.
Gary Maynard belongs to one of the handful of families which are almost universally accepted as having Aboriginal heritage.
The grassroots, core grassroots families, as I mentioned, we can all trace our ancestry back to his daughters.
Yes.
That's my grandfather.
What was his
His name was George William Everett Maynard.
Oh.
And my grandmother was Florence Clara. She was formerly a Mansell.
Yes.
So you probably understand the sort of interrelationships that, of all the families on the island.
These people are all intermarried with one another. They're all related to one another. They all know who they're descended from. This is a community that's very coherent and that has been together as a community since the early 19th century.
Who are the main families who are undeniably Aboriginal?
Well, Mansell, Maynard, Everett, and one or two others.
One of the tribes that we come from, the Bunurong people, when they used to go walk about inland, they used to go into the estuaries there. They used to make big cages. They used to build these big traps. And they'd get all the shellfish, werriners, muttonfish, and they'd put them in those traps and they'd go walk about for how many months, and when they'd come back, they had no problem with food because, you know what happened? They'd all multiplied on me.
Now that looks like a pretty good feed to me.
Gary Maynard's cousins, Grant, Doug and Luke, also moved away from their first home on Cape Barren Island.
It was always the thing that my mum and dad were going to do because it was better housing, electricity, running water, employment, permanent employment for my dad, better education for us.
We then grew up in this town called Penguin, where we was educated. And
I can honestly say that we were the first black family, Aborigines, in the northwest coast of Penguin, and where we was educated.
The Maynard brothers knew what it felt like to be different at school.
Our first day was all these kids coming out and sort of laughing and going, "Oh, look at the gollywogs, look at the niggers," and all this sort of type stuff. And it sort of didn't worry Lukey and I because we didn't even know what the words meant. But the young girl that was with, and she must have been about 13 at the time, she got really upset, started crying. And then to have these other kids later on in life, fair-skinned kids, saying that they're Aboriginal when I was growing up with them and playing sport with them. They're the same kids that calling me bad names.
Youthful experiences like these bonded families and helped politicise their core Aboriginal community. They identified with the land rights movement of the 70s and took up radical protest.
I think the state government have got to look at the views of Aboriginal people in relation to the solutions. For example,
Michael Mansell was the dominant voice of the time.
Mick has been the focal point for the resurrection of Aboriginal people in Tasmania. He's the one that stood up there. He's the one that's been howled at and picked on. Michael is the bloke that's actually put the Tasmanian Aboriginal issues on the world map.
Mansell courted the media by pulling stunts like his trip to Libya with his own Aboriginal passport.
representing the Aboriginal nation.
For one of his companions on that trip, Jim Everett, they were heady days.
It was a really exciting time, high adrenaline running time. We were, to ourselves, so confident that we were unbeatable. And the kinds of things that we were aiming for were always achievable. So, working right up to the very end of the 80s, we were dragging the government behind us.
In 1972, Mansell helped set up the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, or TAC. After a century in which Tasmanians had been taught that the Aborigines died out with Truganini, the TAC claimed a long list of Indigenous members.
I think to some extent they've shot themselves in the foot by virtue of accepting almost every Tom, Dick or Harry who walked through the door, and I believe that the reason for doing that was to get the numbers to be able to apply for and receive funding from the Commonwealth Government.
The TAC grew and prospered, but with the advent of ATSIC in 1990, it no longer held the stage. Now it had to compete for funding with an array of other Aboriginal groups. The Mansell camp saw ATSIC representing white domination.
They get hostile with ATSIC, and sometimes very understandably that, you know, ATSIC is, to me, sometimes tries to stand over community organisations, and it's like a tug of war sometimes.
The TAC now took a purist line. It decided some using its services were not Aboriginal after all.
Many people who were accepted by the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, and indeed some people had been employed at the organisation, received letters in the mail to say that they were no longer accepted as being members of the TAC, and they had been a part of that organisation for a number of years.
In 1999, Michael Mansell, then the centre's legal manager, wrote an internal memo on applications for legal aid. He said there were those whose assertion of Aboriginal descent cannot be substantiated. He exempted several families, including his own, from proving their ancestry because they were undisputedly of Aboriginal descent.
I was brought up as a state ward. That commenced when I was 3 months old. I was taken from my mother, who was an Aboriginal person.
Mansell's contention that Tasmania's real Aborigines come from a small group of families is disputed. John Coleman says his black ancestors missed the tragic migration to Flinders Island and survived among white Tasmanians.
My mother vanished without trace in 1946. She comes from the Dover Hastings area, I was taken from my mother, who's an Aboriginal person, and as I said, made a ward of the state, and that's the way I grew up.
I mean, how dare they tell us we're not Aboriginal? And why do we
Individual
have to go
cases
through
like
the
Coleman's are hard to judge. 6 years ago, this group formed a new community called Liaputa, or Little River People. Kay McPherson is their spokesperson. According to her, any Aborigine who isn't a Bass Strait Islander can join them.
If your history doesn't trace back to the 5 families, and it doesn't trace back directly to the Bass Strait Islands, we don't exist.
Some Liaputa members say they're descended from an entire tribe of Aborigines who lived undiscovered by settlers during and after the Black War. They claim their ancestors were Aborigines who eventually walked unheralded from the Huon forests.
I think it's hard to imagine that it would go unrecorded. I know there are 1 or 2 scraps of evidence. It is not impossible. I certainly can't establish that there was no such tribe. But had there been, given the interest in the Aboriginal question, there would have been many more reports. People would have gone looking for them. There's no question about that.
Was there a community of Aborigines there?
There certainly was not. What happened in the Huon Valley was that there was a track, and it still exists on certain maps, that went from the Aboriginal settlement here at Oyster Cove through to the Huon, where the Aboriginal people who were at Oyster Cove were allowed to go hunting. And they went up there with their dogs and so on. And they were seen by people in the Huon.
Let's just address one specific bone of contention, I think, between yourself and Cassandra Pybus, which is the existence of a hidden, if you like, a hidden Aboriginal tribe in the Huon Valley. Now, she says it just didn't exist. There's no evidence of that. What is the evidence?
Oh, that's gorgeous. I think that epitomises her as a historian. It's very well documented. It's in the original journals of Judd. The fact that the Huon Valley was non-enterable till 1852 because you couldn't penetrate through the bush. In 1853, the Aboriginal people turned up on Judd's farm. Judd had a relationship with the people there for a number of years. They weren't a hidden Aboriginal people at all.
McPherson describes herself as an historical geographer. She boasts a colourful array of ancestors, a free settler and a convict from the First Tasmanian Fleet, Irish warrior chieftains, even a Catholic archbishop. She admits she can't prove her Aboriginal ancestry and says family photographs and parish records which might have provided the hard evidence were burned. Geographically, where do you trace your own Aboriginal ancestry?
I've never really thought about it. No, that's wrong. I can show you on a map, but it's really hard to verbalise. The area would be through New Norfolk, up through the Midlands, not the Midlands so much as... Well, this is going to look really bad on Talina.
No.
It's interesting because it's really hard. I mean, it's New Norfolk area, and that goes through to the east coast. But it also incorporated part of the Huon, but I only associate my ancestry with the Derwent Valley, not the Huon Valley.
You're a very controversial figure here in Tasmania. Can you understand your critics being cynical about your claims to being Aboriginal when you haven't been able to produce the documentary evidence to back it up?
That's their opinion, and they're entitled to their opinion. But I know my family history, and when it's all boiled down, they can't trace their family history back either. If they want to use white people's theories on their Aboriginality, that's fine.
Despite the lack of evidence for her ancestry, McPherson is widely regarded as one of Tasmania's foremost Aboriginal commentators. She's also a self-styled elder of Liaputa. John Coleman, Liaputa's chairman, carried out a smoking ceremony to initiate her, but his memory of it differs from hers.
Kay was initiated as an Aboriginal woman to show her acceptance of herself as an Aboriginal person. She never underwent the smoking ceremony as a child. She decided that she would like to have the smoking ceremony performed, and we did so under those terms.
How did you become an Aboriginal elder?
I was initiated to be an elder because I was too young and I didn't have any grandchildren, and I was initiated because of my knowledge. Yeah.
Can you be initiated as an elder? Is that possible?
Not to my knowledge. And I'm not saying that you can't be, but if you can be, I don't know about it.
The reason I ask you this is because when we spoke to Kay McPherson, she told us that she'd been initiated as an elder, but clearly that wasn't the case.
Definitely not, and I don't know how Kay could have said that. I really don't, because that's not the case. Could never be. Well, not to my knowledge anyway. I couldn't do that, and I don't, you know.
I think that Kay is playing with the fairies a bit. It's embarrassing to us. Now, whether she's Aboriginal or not, I'm not prepared to say because I don't really know. But she certainly is not acting in a way that represents either our tribal cultural images or activities or beliefs.
I was one of the ones that was...
Question marks over Liaputa haven't stopped them from applying for funding. 2 years ago, they asked for over $800,000 for new projects and were turned down. Kay McPherson subsists on ab study, which she'll lose if she fails to get on the Indigenous electoral roll. What will happen if your application is knocked back?
Well, it's going to be knocked back. We all know this.
If people want to identify in a particular way, I think that's entirely up to them. And I don't think it's anyone else's business. However, when that identity becomes the basis for a claim on the rest of us, that is on the state or on the taxpayer, we all have to be concerned. And that seems to me to be the difference. And that's where, unfortunately, people are asked to prove their identity.
Where's the bloody big rock?
Doug Maynard is bitter about what he sees as the headlong rush to jump on the funding bandwagon.
My family, my brothers and sisters, we was only Aboriginal on the northwest coast, and now in Penguin there's a community of 260 Aboriginal descendants. People that we went to school with, people that I fought against, you know, probably broke a couple of noses, I don't know, but they're Aborigines now, you know, like descendants, I should say, Aboriginal descendants, and they get, you know, they are the ones that are in the jobs, setting up organisations. Because of their education, they're the ones doing the policies that affect my life. And
you resent it?
My word, I do. My word, I do. You know, because what's happening to us is a flow on. It's happening. It'll go right up the top end. It's happening right around the whole country. But down here, it's like, you know, it's like I've always said, it's as plain as the nose on your face.
Tasmania's Aboriginal groups receive $6.5 million a year in funding. $1.5 million goes to the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre. The TAC's accounts show substantial amounts of cash in the bank, and its assets include more than $1 million worth of motor vehicles.
When you're talking about millions of dollars sitting in bank accounts earning interest, it does raise some queries, I think.
While the TAC gets the lion's share of cash, money goes to a plethora of other groups and salaried officials. John Clark is regional chairman of ATSIC, the body which decides how much funding each Aboriginal group gets. The post pays him $78,000 a year. Clark's ancestry was questioned in the 1997 court case, but he says his father told him he was Aboriginal when he was 21. What did he tell you?
That we were Aboriginal. Yeah, that was like, I mean, and my grandmother also informed me over a period of time of our Aboriginal heritage.
But you've been challenged about that repeatedly, haven't you?
I've been there, done that, mate, bought the T-shirt and wore it out. That's just a fact of life. That's just part of the politics.
Clark lives on Flinders Island, but his father's family came from the Huon Valley. He heads up the Flinders Island Aboriginal Association, which manages a substantial farm owned by the Indigenous Land Council. The generation Clark wants to inherit the farm can be seen belting round this motocross track. Almost all these kids identify themselves as Aboriginal.
This has been around for years, but it sort of hasn't really, like it sort of died out after a while, and now it's just coming back in the last couple of months actually, and Fee's getting behind it, and local workshop and all that.
The Aboriginal Community
Association,
Centre,
yeah.
Now, John Clark says that you're part of a community which is an Aboriginal community. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I suppose you could look at, yeah, it's like that. My nan was like into that sort of stuff, that sort of deal, and yeah, sort of like all my uncles and aunties, all that are all Aboriginal descent, and so I suppose, yeah.
So, do you think you're going to be interested in finding out more about your Aboriginal ancestry and making that more a part of your life?
Eventually, I wouldn't really see myself like, you know, reading books and that, but if people want to say anything or whatever, I'll listen.
Clark says the motocross helps keep the kids disciplined and drug-free. He applied for ATSIC funding to buy bikes, but didn't get it. He sees nothing wrong with public funds being used for this, especially as he says these kids are Aboriginal.
I mean, it's pretty easy. A $5,000 motorbike is nothing if it stops somebody getting addicted to heroin or gets into juvenile delinquency, or then later on sort of whatever else that can follow on from drug dependency or so on. I mean, that's being reactive, not proactive. Being proactive, not reactive.
Clark's bid to get on the Indigenous electoral roll has been challenged. If he loses his right to vote in the ATSIC election, he will also lose his job as ATSIC chairman.
If that's the case, I think that's a very, very, very sad day for Aboriginal affairs in this state, not only in this state, but for the rest of Australia, because it will mean that local community groups, like we've got on Flinders Island, and local communities, like a separate community, this is a separate community against the other community, won't be able to identify who they want to speak for them and who they want to vote for.
Funding scandals in Aboriginal organisations are not new, but in Tasmania they're complicated by personalities caught in the row over authenticity. In 1999, the offices of ITAC, the Indigenous Tasmanians Aboriginal Corporation, were raided by the police. At the time, ITAC owned and ran 74 rental houses worth $6 million.
They had me signing for thousands of dollars between them, like in TVs, building material, you name it, any household product.
An internal report from ATSIC catalogued a long list of allegations: theft, fraud, infighting, significant and ongoing breaches of funding terms and conditions, poor financial management, misuse of grant funds. There were even death threats.
Told to do things that you didn't want to do, such as signing cheques to dead people. When you asked questions about it, you were told you'd lose your job or your life was threatened. I was told quite a few times how I was going to be killed.
ITAC is now under new management. It says John Coleman was evicted from one of its properties for non-payment of rent over 2.5 years. Coleman, who was also ITAC's chairman for 2 short periods, denies this. He says he was the one who blew the whistle on what was happening there. Was there fraud?
Well, yes, there was fraud.
Was there misappropriation of funds?
Indeed, there was.
Do you know the people responsible?
Yes, I do.
Who are they?
I'm not going to say that on. We have named them to the police, and I have signed the complaint.
No one has been charged despite a lengthy police investigation. But 3 years ago, another organisation, SACT, the Sports Aboriginal Corporation of Tasmania, lost its ATSIC funding.
The group, set up to run an Aboriginal sports and recreation program, has left a trail of debts totalling $777,000. It was granted $500,000 5 years ago to buy its Hobart headquarters.
According to ATSIC, part of the premises had been leased to the Outlaws bikie gang. Equipment was also stolen. The management teams of the housing and sports bodies included acknowledged Aborigines. However, Brian Fisher, who chaired both organisations, is one of those who was challenged in the 1997 court case. How much money in all went missing from ITAC?
None.
Because there were allegations that several $100,000 had gone missing.
It's all rubbish. Police have proved otherwise. I was supposed to get $350,000. It's all rubbish. It doesn't work that way.
What happened to all the equipment at the sports centre?
It was stolen.
Who by?
Well, I just can't put a finger on that. I know who by, but I just can't say at the moment.
In Tasmania, bitterness about who is and isn't Indigenous adds another layer to familiar controversies about Aboriginal funding.
I think really the government opened the door up to a lot of people who aren't Aboriginal sneaking in. And now we're having a big problem in that the people who aren't Aboriginal sneaking into our communities are going to have an impact that is not good for the Aboriginal community, much less the fact that they shouldn't be there anyway.
Last month, the federal government named an Aboriginal panel from Tasmania to consider challenges to voters hoping to join the ATSIC roll. The principle articulated by Michael Mansell last year appeared sound.
Everybody is open to challenge. That includes me, includes everybody. And the whole idea behind these Aboriginal elections is to make it fair, make it reasonable, and make it appropriate, so that before people go to an election, you know that the candidates are Aborigines, and those who are participating in voting are in fact Aborigines.
In practice, the result has been chaos. Just 1,300 people have applied to vote. Michael Mansell isn't one of them, and so cannot be challenged, but hundreds have been. Why have you personally challenged 900 applicants for the electoral roll?
Simply because they're not Aboriginal people.
The date of the ATSIC elections has now been put back due to the sheer volume of challenges received.
That panel's got a very important job on what they're doing, and I don't envy them people on that panel. It's going to be a very hard job. This is a very important role that they've got, and I think that people don't realise the importance of this role.
I'll start cleaning and Andrew will help you with the gears. Come over here a minute.
Rodney Dillon is the current ATSIC Commissioner for Tasmania. He likes nothing more than an afternoon spent diving for abalone and cooking up a feed with fellow ATSIC councillor Rocky Sainty. Dillon tries to steer clear of the controversy associated with community identity.
I've tried to stick to culture and issues like that, rather than if I sat down and thought about who was Aboriginal and who was not, I reckon I'd become a very twisted man.
Dillon recognises that people who've worked long and hard within their own communities may soon be stripped of their public identity.
Some of those people from all areas are my friends, you know. It's a pretty uncomfortable time that we're all going through, and that's how this has been for quite a while, and it's been uncomfortable. Unless something is done like this, we're going to keep going through this, and we'll end up destroying ourselves.
I think that the process, for what it's worth, and I can't think of a better one, has to be done. That's what's going to be done.
But could it lead to even more disagreements?
Well, so be it, because, like, you know, I mean, the people who have snuck in, the people who want to keep sneaking in, are going to still be there. So there's always going to be disagreements until this is sorted out about who is and who isn't.
Ethnic cleansing and genocide do not need bloodshed to achieve their aims. Death by denial of existence instigated into the fabric of democracy by bureaucratic bullies whose manipulation...
The Liaputa community, Kay McPherson and her friends, are among those trying to join the ATSIC roll. Most have been challenged. McPherson says she'll write to the United Nations if, as is likely, her group is denied the opportunity to vote.
Since 1996, we've been denied access to absolutely everything that's Aboriginal, all because we're not from the Bass Strait Islands. They're writing the rules, they're enforcing the rules, and we're supposed to live by them. They're denying us who we are. So isn't that genocide? Isn't that ethnic cleansing?
Well, genocide means wiping out entire communities and groups of people. No one's trying to kill you.
No, but they're wiping us out as far as our heritage goes. we're being denied who we are. That's genocide.
Tasmania's problem may soon become wider Australia's.
I suspect the same problem might arise in many of the older settled parts of Australia, the southwest of Western Australia, South Australia, and parts of Victoria and New South Wales. Now, I've talked to some of my friends from those parts of Australia, and they say, oh, look, there's no problem. The communities know who belongs, and they will determine the situation, so that anyone claiming will fall by the hurdle of community acceptance. But when I explain to them that there are whole communities that establish themselves and identify as Aboriginal, that others doubt, rightly or wrongly, they are amazed and see that this may well indeed become a problem in many parts of Australia.
Even if the problem is recognised, the solution is far from clear. The man who went to Libya with Michael Mansell sees a tough road ahead.
The hardening of the doors into Aboriginal communities will come, and it's a phase that we're going to be faced with for quite a period, I believe. We can't afford to sit back and leave this door half open and only check it every now and then.
Debbie Oakford, who's worked for a number of Aboriginal bodies, now thinks all funding for Tasmania's Indigenous groups should be stopped.
I have thought long and hard for a long time, how could it be fixed or a solution came about? How could I get a solution for this? And I thought, well, if there was no funding, there'd be nobody to argue with, no greed, and everybody would live as one happy family.
Hopefully.
Well, yeah.
Black fella, white fella, it doesn't matter what your colour, as long as you're a true fella, as long as you're...
The passionate debate in Tasmania has failed to answer one fundamental question. At what point do families cease to be Aboriginal and become principally European? Is it time to consider another definition of Indigenous identity?
There are many, many, many Aboriginal families over the last 200 years who have ceased to be Aboriginal and now see themselves as European. This process is probably going on all the time and has been going on since the beginning of European settlement. But we still have no real agreement about where that point is, or whether indeed there should be a category that scarcely exists in Australia, and that is people of mixed descent. Now, it seems to me the lack of that category in Australia is one of the things that means this problem will continue as far ahead as I can see.
You can join an online discussion including Cassandra Pybus, Kay McPherson and reporter Quentin McDermott from 9:30 tonight Eastern Time at abc.net.au/4corners.
Powerful